They say water holds memories. If that notion is true, then this particular body of water has absorbed every facet of my existence. I recall tranquil dawns shared with my spouse preceding her illness and angling with my son before he relocated to the western states. And then there were those countless solitary moments on the pier when I sought solace and mental clarity. This lake was far more than a mere expanse of water adjacent to my residence. It represented a historical record mine, that of my family, and indeed of this entire community. I settled in Oak Hollow precisely 15 years ago, following my retirement from the Corps of Engineers. While civil engineering might not immediately strike one as a military pursuit, a significant portion of my career was dedicated to overseeing dams and reservoirs in distant lands, averting catastrophes in regions largely overlooked by the media. Consequently, when I acquired the modest stone dwelling, distinguished by its faded green shutters and a pier that gracefully curved towards the lake, I believed I had finally found a haven of peace. In those days, the Homeowners Association was rather unobtrusive. It comprised a handful of retired individuals whose primary concerns were maintaining tidy lawns and ensuring the uniformity of mailbox colors. There was no pretense of grandiosity. Their enforcement was minimal, which suited me perfectly. Although the lake was technically communal property, my land abutted its most expansive section. I personally constructed a bench there, treating the cedar to resist the elements. No one voiced any objections. The lake's surface transformed with each passing season. Spring heralded the arrival of frogs and dragonflies. Summer brought the occasional passing canoe. In autumn, a mist would ascend from the water, much like a memory stirring from slumber. And then there was winter. Winter was when the lake became a sheet of still, glassy ice, as if it were listening. That's what made the subsequent discovery so jarring. Scout, my dog part German Shepherd, part all heart, began to growl at the waterline. He has, on more occasions than I can count, been my savior. It was an early April morning during our customary circuit along the rear trail when he suddenly stopped, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I followed his gaze to the shore. The water had receded. And I mean noticeably, tangibly. The lake's edge used to lap at the stone embankment where the pier commenced, but now it lay almost 3 feet lower, revealing a wide expanse of damp earth and tangled vegetation that had not seen sunlight in years. Initially, I attempted to rationalize it. March had seen no substantial rainfall. Perhaps the snowmelt runoff was slower than usual. However, having lived in close proximity to this lake and its rhythms for so long, I possessed an innate understanding of natural phenomena, and this was decidedly unnatural. Back at the house, I retrieved the historical water level charts I maintained. These were records compiled years ago when the previous HOA president, Mr. Carlson, sought assistance in diagnosing seepage issues within the lake. I had meticulously charted the water table fluctuations over a 4-year period and even modeled potential evaporation rates during dry spells. None of these analyses explained the current drastic decline. It became apparent that someone was actively draining the lake. Later that afternoon, I ventured to the southern bank near the overflow channel. There it was, a pipe protruding from the bank like an exposed bone, angled precisely to divert water away from the retention basin and into the dry ravine bordering the far edge of the neighborhood. This pipe had not been present before. It was a recent installation, evidenced by its crude welds and the fresh scars of disturbed earth. I documented everything, photographing the site, recording the GPS coordinates, and measuring the flow rate with a handheld device I still possessed from my fieldwork days. The following day, I arrived at the HOA office, a nondescript beige building adjacent to the clubhouse, a file folder clutched under my arm. Linda, the new manager, barely acknowledged my presence. "You require an appointment, Mr. Hargrove," she stated without looking up. I insisted that the matter was urgent. She sighed, picked up the phone, and within 5 minutes I was escorted into a small conference room where 3 board members sat, their arms folded. Presiding at the head of the table was Brad Whitmore, a man in his late 30s, a former tech sales representative who had appointed himself the neighborhood's property czar. Since his election as HOA president last year, he had aggressively pursued modernization initiatives, increased surveillance cameras, drone deployment, digitized violation notices, and power washing the sidewalks every 2 weeks, irrespective of their actual need. I presented my findings, the documents, photographs, flow calculations, and a concise overview of local hydrological patterns. Someone has installed a pipe into the southern retention outlet, I stated. It is draining the lake. They exchanged glances, and Brad then let out a chuckle. Are you serious? I am, I replied. You believe we are siphoning off the lake like some cartoon villain. Come now. I am stating that the water level has dropped 3 feet in less than a week, and an unauthorized pipe is bleeding it into the gully, I retorted. If you did not authorize it, then someone is acting illegally. If you did authorize it, you may be violating both county watershed codes and the covenants of this community. That comment wiped the smirk from his face. Do you have any idea how paranoid you sound? One of the board members interjected. I spent 20 years managing water in combat zones, I stated calmly. This lake is bleeding out, and if you do not act now, you will kill it. Brad rose. Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. We will look into it. But I could already feel the invisible barrier being erected. I intentionally left the folder behind. Let them ponder its contents. That night, I sat on my bench by the lake, Scout resting at my feet. The moonlight cast long silver streaks across the surface, yet they were insufficient to conceal the scars, the fresh mudline, the absence of the gentle lapping against the pier's supports. I had witnessed rivers vanish due to upstream manipulation. I had seen entire ecosystems collapse when engineers cut corners, but I never imagined witnessing such a decline in my own backyard, not due to war or weather, but because of arrogance, because certain individuals believed their spreadsheets possessed greater wisdom than the land itself. The subsequent HOA newsletter arrived the following week, delivered digitally as part of Brad's new sustainability initiative, deeming paper wasteful. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, scrolling through the PDF on my old tablet. There it was, nestled between a paragraph on power, washing the tennis courts, and a cheerful photograph of Brad posing beside a meticulously trimmed hedge. Water Optimization Project Phase 1. Completed. The HOA has successfully improved lake drainage and erosion control on the southern shore. Residents can expect enhanced mosquito mitigation and reduced flooding risks moving forward. A chill ran down my spine. Improved drainage. That's how they were framing it. I knew then that the pipe I had observed was not unauthorized. It was deliberate, sanctioned, and alarmingly, merely Phase 1. I continued reading, my eyes scanning too rapidly to fully process the information, akin to watching a vehicle collision unfold in slow motion. They outlined plans for new landscaping around the lake, controlled runoff systems, and a water feature redesign involving the reshaping of the shoreline. Excavation may cause temporary closures to trail access, it stated. Excavation. I set my coffee mug down with enough force to rattle the table. Scout looked up from his spot by the refrigerator, sensing my agitation. They're not just draining it, I murmured. They're gutting it. I returned outside, walking the trail that skirted the lake's perimeter. The early spring had left a film of pollen on the water, but now that pollen clung to the parched mudbanks. Tadpole pools were stranded in shallow puddles, their futures evaporating by the hour. Across the lake I saw them, 3 men in high-visibility vests, armed with shovels and marking stakes. A small bobcat tractor sat on the trail, its engine still warm. They were expanding the drainage efforts. One of the workers looked up and waved. I did not reciprocate the gesture. Instead, I marched directly home and retrieved the covenant documents from my purchase folder, which I had meticulously maintained for 15 years, neatly filed in a weathered accordion binder in my study. I perused pages of legal jargon until I found it, Article 4, concerning common areas and environmental protections. It clearly stipulated any modifications to shared natural resources require the approval of 80% of the homeowner vote at a public hearing. There had been no hearing, no vote, no announcements, only a newsletter distributed after the fact. I printed the relevant pages, highlighted the critical language, and composed a letter. I presented it in person at the next HOA meeting. Brad occupied his usual position at the front of the room, flanked by his predictable entourage. Folding chairs scraped against the clubhouse floor as a handful of residents entered, mostly retirees, a few young couples, and some unfamiliar faces. "Let's begin," Brad announced, his characteristic smirk a clear sign of his perceived superiority. When the floor was open for resident comments, I stood. "I would like to address the water optimization project," I stated, holding my papers in one hand. Brad sighed. "Mr. Hargrove, we have already—" "I have here Article 4 of the HOA covenants," I continued. "It mandates a homeowner vote prior to any modifications to the lake. This never occurred." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. A woman in the back whispered something to her husband. Brad took a breath, his smile still present but visibly strained. "The board determined that the project qualified as routine maintenance," he stated, "which does not necessitate a vote. Routine maintenance does not involve excavation or re-engineering the shoreline," I countered. "That is not maintenance. That is modification." Another wave of whispers swept through the attendees. A man near the window nodded in agreement. Brad's jaw twitched. "The HOA has consulted with our landscaping partners and legal counsel. We are confident in our process." "Then you won't object if I present this to the County Water Authority," I stated. "Let them determine if draining a public access retention lake qualifies as routine." Silence descended. For a moment, Brad appeared disconcerted, as if he had misjudged the room. Then, he leaned forward and addressed the microphone. "Mr. Hargrove, your tone is bordering on hostile. If you continue to disrupt these meetings, we will have to file a behavioral violation." Gasps erupted. That was clearly a threat, and everyone in the room understood it. I met his gaze. "File whatever you deem appropriate, but I will continue to speak. That lake does not belong to you. It belongs to all of us." That was the turning point. Not officially, not publicly, but I saw a flicker of doubt in the residents' eyes. The way Mrs. Blandon, who had maintained her distance from me since her husband's passing, leaned forward as if she intended to speak. I departed the meeting without another word. The following day, I received a letter in the mail, a certified violation notice for disruptive behavior at an HOA meeting, Level 2. A fine of $250. I laughed aloud, Scout offering a single bark in agreement. They intended to wage war against me over a lake my lake, but they had not reviewed my credentials. They were unaware that in a box in my attic resided a binder filled with environmental permits, sediment studies, and erosion control models I had developed for projects in Kandahar and Sierra Leone. They did not know I had testified before congressional subcommittees on watershed safety. They presumed I was merely a cantankerous old man with a bench and a dog. Let them maintain that illusion. The quieter I remained now, the more impactful my voice would be when I chose to raise it again. I commenced with respect. I always do. I have learned that warnings, no matter how urgent, fall on deaf ears if delivered with disdain. Therefore, I attempted patience. I pursued diplomacy. However, when individuals become inebriated by power, particularly petty authority, they disregard words. They only perceive threats to their fabricated sense of control. After receiving the violation notice, I submitted a written appeal, attaching copies of the HOA's own bylaws and highlighting the specific article mandating community votes on environmental alterations. I included a diagram illustrating the drainage pipe's flow path and a side-by-side satellite image depicting the lake's observable shrinkage over a mere 3 weeks. I personally delivered it to the HOA office and handed it to Linda, the manager. She barely glanced at the envelope before sliding it into a pile of other paperwork as if it were merely a promotional flyer. "Brad is out," she stated. "He will get to it." "How long before the board reviews an appeal?" I inquired. She shrugged. "Typically at the next meeting." "That's in 3 weeks." "Correct." "The lake may not have 3 weeks." Her fingers paused on her keyboard. She looked up. "Are you threatening the HOA, Mr. Hargrove?" I let out a laugh, but it was devoid of humor. "I am attempting to prevent you from destroying the very element that gives this neighborhood its name." Oak Hollow Lake was not merely a picturesque body of water. It was the foundation of property values, the focal point of the community's marketing strategy, and the primary reason half the residents had chosen to move here. Every promotional brochure featured the same stock photograph. Sunlight glinting off ripples, children feeding ducks, canoes gliding through calm mornings. But Brad was indifferent to such considerations. He had not grown up with a reverence for the land. He had been raised with applications, quarterly objectives, and slide decks that advocated for optimization in every third sentence. Thus, I escalated. I dispatched an email to the HOA listserv, meticulously avoiding inflammatory language. I presented only the facts: the decline in water levels, the environmental clause, the absence of a vote. I appended photographs and measurements. I signed off with my credentials, not to boast, but to signal that I was not simply an irate homeowner, but someone who understood the principles of hydrology. The replies trickled in slowly. A few expressed thanks for sharing or found it interesting. Some admitted they hadn't noticed the water level drop, but there was no concrete action. Then Mrs. Holcomb from Lot 17 replied, "I have resided here for 22 years, and I have never witnessed the lake at such a low level. I assumed it was merely the dry season. If they are intentionally draining it, that is not right." Others followed. A young father emailed me, recounting how his children used to fish off the dock, but the fish were now gone. A woman who jogged around the lake mentioned noticing an odor reminiscent of algae and decay. Someone else forwarded the newsletter, inquiring, "Is this what you meant by Phase 1? It offered a glimmer, a fragile spark of hope. So I took it a step further. I began going door to door, not to every residence, but specifically to those with direct lake access or properties bordering the trails. I carried printouts of the satellite images, a one-page summary of my findings, and maintained a calm demeanor. Some welcomed me into their homes, others offered polite nods, but kept their doors closed. However, by the 10th house, word had already circulated. "You're the lake guy," a teenager remarked, answering the door in a basketball jersey. "Guilty," I confirmed. "My dad says you're right, that it's drying up. Tell your dad, thanks for keeping an open mind." Still, not everyone appreciated my efforts. A week later, I discovered that my cedar bench by the lake had been vandalized. Spray paint marred its surface with offensive words, the kind one would prefer children not encounter. Furthermore, a new violation notice was affixed to my front door. Unapproved distribution of printed materials. Level 1 violation. No monetary penalty this time, merely a warning. Scout growled when I removed it. I did not disclose its contents to him. Dogs do not need to bear such burdens. I spent the evening sanding the bench clean. The slurs were eradicated, but the scar in the wood remained. Nevertheless, I persevered. I attended the subsequent HOA meeting, armed with a thumb drive containing my comprehensive report, charts, photographs, projections of soil impact. I offered to present a 10-minute summary. Brad did not even include me on the agenda. "I am sorry," he stated, his voice syrupy through the microphone. "We are short on time today, perhaps at the next meeting." I stood up regardless. "I will be brief," I said, plugging the drive into the projector. He attempted to intervene, but the room was attentive now, and the board had not officially concluded the public comment period. I advanced through the slides, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Water lines, flow rates, comparative lake levels. I concluded with a quotation from the HOA's own founding charter. "The preservation of shared natural resources shall remain paramount to the association's duty to its residents." The room fell silent. Brad's face flushed red. "Are you finished, Mr. Hargrove?" he inquired. "That depends," I responded. "Are you listening?" He struck the gavel. "You are out of order, but the damage had been done." Following the meeting, a couple approached me in the parking lot. Retired teachers, they informed me they had resided there since the community's inception and that what was happening to the lake was criminal, if not outright illegal. They offered their assistance, stating they would begin canvassing neighbors and potentially gathering signatures. "We are not lawyers," the man said, "but we care. And we remember a time when people used to listen around here." I thanked them and drove home, settling onto my dark porch with Scout at my feet. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting nothing but starlight and uncertainty. It was diminishing, but so too was the silence. The initial act of reprisal occurred the very next morning. I awoke to discover two uniformed individuals, contractors, not law enforcement, planting a brightly colored orange sign on my front lawn. In bold block letters it declared, "Notice, non-compliant landscaping violation, pending review." Scout barked furiously through the screen door as I stepped outside barefoot, still clutching my mug of coffee. The men avoided eye contact. One of them handed me a carbon copy form before departing my property as if I were contagious. According to the citation, my yard was in violation of HOA Standard 7.2, unmaintained perimeter edging. Perimeter edging. I stared at the flower bed bordering my driveway, where the mulch was fresh, the hedges neatly trimmed, and the stone borders perfectly aligned. It looked precisely as it had every year since I moved in. Pristine, unobtrusive, and unequivocally compliant. This had nothing to do with landscaping. It was a punitive measure. The letter in my mailbox later that day confirmed it, detailing 3 violations in total. 1. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. 2. Disruptive behavior at official meetings. 3. Distribution of unsanctioned materials. Each carried a fine of $250, totaling $750, due within 15 days, or risk legal collection through HOA lien authority. They were no longer attempting to conceal their actions. I did not remit the payment. Instead, I compiled documentation for each violation and dispatched a registered letter to the HOA board, formally contesting all 3. I included time-stamped photographs of my yard, a transcribed record of the meeting demonstrating I had spoken during the open forum, and a scanned copy of the community bylaws, which stipulated that no approval was necessary for distributing printed information among residents. A week later, I received another notice. This one declared I was now classified as a repeat offender, subject to accelerated enforcement action. What did that entail? According to the attached packet, access to HOA-maintained facilities was suspended, invitations to board meetings were revoked, and legal fees might be assessed at the HOA's discretion. I contacted the HOA office. Linda answered, her tone robotic. "You will need to direct all correspondence to the enforcement subcommittee." "And who, may I ask, is on that subcommittee?" "I am not at liberty to say." "Of course not. Opaque bureaucracy, that was their shield and their weapon. Knowing better than to shout into the void, I altered my approach. I met with other residents discreetly, casually, never in large gatherings. We conversed over coffee during walks after church. I posed questions, listened attentively, and took notes. A pattern began to emerge. Mrs. DeMarco had been fined $300 last month for improper fence paint, despite her fence perfectly matching the HOA's approved color palette. Her appeal was filed and subsequently denied. The Tanners received a warning for unsanctioned garage use because their nephew practiced drums there after school. Another resident, Jorge, informed me his vehicle was towed from his own driveway for being inoperable, although it was merely awaiting a battery replacement. The incident cost him nearly $1,000 in fees and towing charges. One by one, these narratives converged, different specifics, yet the identical underlying theme: control. Under Brad's leadership, the HOA was not focused on community preservation. It was about dominance, micromanagement, and the silencing of dissent. And now, I had become their symbol of resistance. They were not merely punishing me, they were deliberately making an example of me. Therefore, I provided them with a justifiable reason to escalate. I printed 150 flyers titled, "How the HOA is Draining Our Lake and Our Rights," and distributed them in mailboxes under the cover of early morning fog. There was no sensationalism, only irrefutable evidence, photographs, quotes from the covenants, contact information for the County Water Authority, and a direct link to file complaints. That same evening, 2 security guards appeared at my doorstep. private security personnel hired by the HOA. They presented me with a cease and desist letter stating that if I placed one more unsanctioned document, they would report me to municipal code enforcement. On what grounds? I inquired, barely suppressing a chuckle. They offered no reply, simply turning and departing. Scout observed their retreat from the window, much like a guard on duty. That evening my phone rang. It was Dana. She had been my wife's closest companion before the illness claimed her. We hadn't spoken in months. She resided just a couple of streets away and generally kept to herself. Dana explained that Brad had visited my residence that afternoon, alleging I was disseminating dangerous falsehoods and labeling me as unstable. I closed my eyes. He's now going from house to house, she continued, attempting to discredit me. However, people are more perceptive than he realizes. You are not alone, you understand. I remained silent for a moment, realizing a part of me had forgotten what it felt like to be believed. Then, Dana added, I submitted a formal complaint to the county water board utilizing your provided form. I believed that would carry weight, as this wasn't solely about me or a single body of water. It represented the gradual degradation of our shared environments, the erosion of quiet dignity, and the diminishing trust among neighbors to act responsibly. They sought to silence me, fine me, and brand me. Instead, in their view, I was becoming something even more detrimental, credible. I understood the retribution would intensify. However, so would the momentum. Just as water finds a new course when obstructed, so would I. The lake did not vanish abruptly. Its demise was a slow, drawn-out exhalation. Each day the water's edge receded further, exposing dark, muddy depths and ancient roots that had not seen sunlight for decades. The once buoyant dock now sagged precariously over shrinking puddles, resembling the exposed ribcage of a starved creature. Neighbors ceased using the walking path. The nightly chorus of frogs fell silent. Scout no longer ventured into the shallows, as there was nothing left to wade into. By the close of April, the cattails had turned a dull yellow. A viscous algal bloom spread across the surface, akin to decay consuming flesh. I witnessed birds descend, only to veer away, circling back towards the trees as if the water no longer welcomed them. And the odor, an overwhelming stench that began subtly, like damp leaves festering in a drainpipe, soon escalated into a nauseating sourness that permeated clothing and stung the nostrils. Joggers began crossing to the opposite side of the street as they approached the lake. Some wore masks, while others simply stopped coming altogether. Despite this, the Homeowners Association maintained its stance. Brad issued another newsletter, this one headlined, "Low water levels due to seasonal variation. No cause for alarm." They attributed the issue to climatic patterns, drought, and natural cycles. Yet, I had resided here for 15 years and had experienced dry springs before, but never anything like this. In one of their weekly mass communications, they distorted a NOAA report, attempting to assert that the evaporation rates were within acceptable parameters. I had read the same report, which pertained to desert reservoirs in Arizona, not suburban lakes in the mid-Atlantic region, with a 30% tree canopy and a stable watershed. I drafted a counter-argument and dispatched it to every resident whose contact information I possessed. Some responded with gratitude, while others remained silent. The true impact, however, manifested subtly through hushed conversations at mailboxes, brief nods from fellow dog walkers, and lingering, troubled glances toward the lake. Then, the fish appeared. I recall the first one, its belly upturned, floating near the northern cove like an ominous omen. By the week's end, dozens had surfaced. The HOA attempted a cleanup. One morning, a crew of teenagers, clad in orange vests and latex gloves, arrived to collect the deceased fish in black garbage bags. However, the fish continued to appear, and with them, the press. A local freelance journalist captured an image of the scene, dead fish juxtaposed against the receding waterline. In the background, my cedar bench and a sign proclaiming HOA caring for our natural spaces were visible. This stark irony was not of my design. Nature had provided it. 3 days later, an article titled, "What's Happening to Oak Hollow Lake?" appeared on a community blog. While not an investigative piece, it posed pertinent questions and quoted two anonymous residents expressing concern about the declining water levels. I was certain one of them was Dana. The article concluded with a call for a town hall discussion. Brad responded with swift dismissal and mockery, sending an all-resident email that began, "It's unfortunate that a few disgruntled individuals are spreading misinformation and causing undue panic. The board assures you that everything is under control." Then, as if to underscore his disdain for our intelligence, he added, "Our environmental consultants remain confident that these fluctuations are temporary and not a result of HOA action." The word fluctuations incensed me. The water level had dropped over 4 feet. The southern inlet was completely dry. Yet to Brad, this was merely a fluctuation. The following weekend, I visited the parched area where the pipe had been installed. Wearing waders and carrying a soil probe, I collected sediment samples, water readings, and temperature and pH levels, meticulously documenting every detail. My findings confirmed my deepest fears. The pipe had not only diverted water, but had also initiated erosion in the deeper silt beds, releasing anaerobic gases and disrupting the delicate bacterial balance crucial for the lake's ecosystem. What remained was stagnant, toxic sludge. A few days later, a child from the north side was rushed to the emergency room with a rash after contact with the water. The HOA dismissed it as an unfortunate coincidence. That was the turning point. Fear began to chip away at their facade of control. More residents started to voice their concerns. Mr. Tanaka, who resided across the lake, confronted Brad at a meeting, demanding an explanation for why the original drainage project had never been put to a vote. The Crawfords, a quiet retired couple who typically avoided conflict, stood and read a letter from their physician stating that the air quality near the lake had exacerbated their daughter's asthma for the first time in years. Throughout this, I remained silent, allowing the consequences to speak for themselves and the lake to cry out in its desolation while the board squirmed in denial. Then came the survey. An anonymous homeowner initiated an online poll with a single question: "Do you trust the HOA's handling of the lake?" Within 2 days, it garnered over 80 responses, with 72 indicating a lack of trust. Brad labeled it a coordinated smear campaign, but his unease was palpable. It was evident in his posture at meetings, shoulders hunched, voice higher pitched, his laughter forced. He began deflecting blame, citing legacy drainage issues and the poor maintenance of previous boards. I almost felt a pang of sympathy, but only almost. Then he issued another violation, this one different. It claimed my unauthorized soil collection and testing posed a liability to the neighborhood and could result in legal action. That was the moment I ceased playing defense. That night, I retrieved a manila envelope from a filing cabinet in my garage, sealed with tape. Inside was a list of names and contact details from my years as a consultant for the Department of Natural Resources, along with a letter I had drafted months prior but never sent. It was addressed to the State Environmental Protection Bureau. This time, I sent it via registered mail, certified, with copies of all supporting documentation. The water was disappearing, but so too was the HOA's control over the narrative. It wasn't long after my letter reached the State Environmental Protection Bureau that pressure began to mount. 2 weeks later, a white government vehicle bearing green lettering and official state plates drove through Oak Hollow. A woman in a blazer, sunglasses, and sturdy field boots emerged and proceeded down the lake trail with a clipboard. Her name was Elaine Turner, a senior investigator. She didn't approach my home, nor did I expect her to. That's not how these investigations typically proceed. However, from my porch, I observed her walk the perimeter, pause at the southern bank, make a note, and photograph the drainage pipe. By dusk, the HOA's group email buzzed with a new message from Brad. Residents may have noticed a state vehicle on site today. This was part of a routine inspection following recent heavy rains and concerns over natural erosion. There is yet no cause for alarm. Heavy rains. We hadn't experienced more than a drizzle in weeks. The only thing truly raining in Oak Hollow was public outrage, and even that was trickling in thanks to the board's censorship efforts. But then, Something unexpected occurred, something even I hadn't foreseen. Brad convened an emergency HOA meeting. His tone in the invitation was unusually measured, almost conciliatory. We want to address misinformation head-on and open a productive dialogue. I arrived at the clubhouse 15 minutes early, yet still had to stand in the back. The room was packed. Residents, young and old, occupied folding chairs with people lining the walls. I recognized neighbors I hadn't seen in years. Even those who typically kept to themselves were present, clutching coffee mugs and casting disapproving glances toward the stage. Brad stood at the podium with two other board members, a projector screen behind them. He cleared his throat. Let me start by saying, we hear your concerns and we want to clarify some of the misconceptions surrounding the lake. He clicked to the first slide, a chart labeled Annual Rainfall Oak Hollow 2019. A blue bar graph depicted a modest decline over time. This data, he stated, shows that what we're seeing isn't the result of HOA projects, but rather a broader weather trend impacting the region. Polite nods, a few furrowed brows. I raised my hand. Yes, Mr. Hargrove, I said, keeping my voice steady. That chart shows rainfall, not lake water levels. Do you have any hydrological data on actual volume displacement since Phase 1 began? A pause ensued, followed by Brad's smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. We're not hydrologists, Mr. Hargrove, but we trust the experts we've hired. And who are they? I pressed. Outsource Environmental Solutions. I heard whispers ripple through the room. Outsource? That's a landscaping company. I've seen their trucks, mowers, and leaf blowers, not water scientists. And is this the same company that installed the drainage pipe? I inquired. Brad hesitated. Yes, under board supervision. So, to summarize, I said, turning to the room, the HOA hired a landscaping crew with no documented expertise in watershed management to engineer an unvoted drainage alteration, which coincided with the lake dropping over 4 feet, the ecosystem collapsing, and a state investigation being triggered. And now you're blaming rain that broke the dam? Murmurs erupted into voices into anger. Someone near the front shouted, "We want a vote on this board." Another added, "You lied to us." Brad's microphone briefly cut out as he fumbled with the cable. Then, desperately, he attempted to shift the blame again. There's also been a campaign of misinformation, he declared. One resident in particular has undermined confidence in this board through illegal soil sampling, anonymous flyers, and exaggerated claims. We believe this individual has created unnecessary panic. You mean me? I asked. All heads turned. You can say my name, Brad. A silence fell like a curtain. I stepped forward. I've lived here 15 years. I've paid dues on time, mowed my lawn, voted in meetings. I even helped your predecessor fix an erosion problem on lot 29 years ago. You want to call me a troublemaker? Fine. But what I've done is ask questions, the same ones all of us should have been asking from the beginning. Dana stood beside me now. We trusted this board, she said, her voice clear and strong. But we didn't elect a dictatorship. We didn't elect silence. Others joined in. The Crawfords, Mr. Tanaka, Mrs. Holcomb. One by one, voices lifted. Brad, his mouth set in a grim line, his eyes darting, looked for someone to rescue him. No one did. Elaine Turner, the state investigator, was in the back corner, arms crossed. I hadn't seen her enter. She was observing everything. By the time the meeting concluded, Brad didn't take questions. He exited through a side door, trailed by 2 board members who appeared to be having second thoughts. The following morning, a state-issued notice of compliance violation was posted on the HOA office door. Failure to secure environmental permits, unauthorized modification of a shared water resource, pending fines, pending enforcement. Brad released a statement claiming the board had acted in good faith and blamed inherited issues from prior management. I received an apology letter in my mailbox the next day. Not from Brad, but from one of the newer board members. It was a typed note on plain paper. Mr. Hargrove, I regret not speaking up sooner. You were right. We're working to reverse the damage and cooperate fully with the state. Thank you." It was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature. I had the lake, or what was left of it. More importantly, I had the truth. Elaine Turner didn't delay. By the end of that week, state-issued notices began arriving in residents' mailboxes, not just at the HOA office. Each bore the seal of the Department of Environmental Protection and a formal tone that made the gravity unmistakable. "You are receiving this notice as a stakeholder in an ongoing investigation regarding the mismanagement of a protected water resource under shared jurisdiction. Your cooperation is requested for future restoration efforts and public hearings." For the first time, the HOA wasn't just answerable to us, they were answerable to the state, and it was about damn time. It didn't take much to accelerate the probe. Elaine contacted me directly a few days later, not as a resident but as a technical witness. I had attached enough documentation in my letter to warrant a field assessment, and my background in hydrology gave me standing as a formal contributor. We met at the lake just after dawn. The air still carried a faint scent of rot and algae, but the water had stabilized, likely due to recent rains, and the board finally halting all modifications. Elaine stepped into the muddy grass in steel-toed boots, clipboard in hand, and asked me to walk her through everything. I showed her the drainage pipe, the cut runoff channels, the erosion marks along the banks, and the red flag indicators in the sediment. I gave her my soil samples, which she said they would fast-track for lab analysis. "Did they ever file permits for any of this?" she asked. "Not to my knowledge, and I've been digging." "Same here," she replied. "We found 0 filings in the county office, no environmental impact review, no engineer of record signature on anything." "That's criminal negligence," I stated flatly. She nodded. "Could be. Depends what the state attorney decides, but we're building a case." She paused, looked at the water, then added, "You did the right thing, Mr. Hargrove. Most people just complain. You documented. You organized." I didn't respond. The truth was, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, worn down, like an old dam holding back more than just water, but I nodded. "Thanks." The community, meanwhile, was beginning to shift in a way I hadn't seen since I first moved in. People who had kept to themselves started conversing over fences again. Parents warned their children to avoid the water, but they also began asking each other questions about HOA processes, budgets, meeting minutes, and elections. For the first time, they weren't afraid of the board. One Saturday, I observed a dozen neighbors gathered near the lake trail with gloves and trash bags. Someone had posted a cleanup day on the local forum. No board approval, just residents reclaiming their space. I walked over with Scout and joined them. We picked up trash, pulled invasive plants, and cleared debris washed down from the dry inlet. Dana showed up too, bringing lemonade in a cooler, just like my wife used to during the summers when the children would run barefoot around the docks. "I can't remember the last time this place felt like a neighborhood," she commented. "Me neither," I agreed. A few days later, Elaine called again. The lab results were back. The lake had elevated nitrogen and phosphorus levels consistent with artificial disturbance, likely from sediment exposure and equipment runoff. Combined with the rapid water loss, it had dealt a near-fatal blow to the aquatic ecosystem. The state moved quickly after that. An official cease and desist order was filed against the HOA, halting all landscaping or infrastructure work near the lake. A separate injunction demanded the immediate dismantling of the drainage pipe and full disclosure of any third-party contractors used. And then came the most satisfying envelope I've ever opened, a letter addressed to me from the Office of the State Environmental Attorney. "As the initiating party and primary witness in this matter, your cooperation has been instrumental in the state's enforcement action. We are pursuing civil penalties against the HOA board for unauthorized environmental modification and will be recommending restitution measures be adopted under court supervision." They were going to court, and this time not as the ones issuing fines, but as the ones answering for them. I made copies and dropped one into Brad's mailbox. No note, no gloating, just facts. At the next HOA meeting, the room was overflowing again, but this time Brad didn't take the podium. He wasn't there. Instead, an interim board member stood shakily at the microphone, and read from a prepared statement. Effective immediately, Bradley Whitmore has resigned as president of the Oak Hollow HOA. The board is cooperating fully with state authorities and will be holding a special election to fill vacated seats. The room was silent. No applause, no jeers, just a long-held breath finally exhaled. Then, someone near the front turned around, looked at me, and gave a quiet nod. Another followed, then another. No words, just silent gratitude. That night I stood on my dock, the planks dry and creaky, but still standing, and gazed out at the lake. It wasn't healed, not yet. Perhaps not for years, but the bleeding had stopped. And sometimes that's the best first step. The hearing itself wasn't dramatic. There were no cameras, no booming gavel sounds as you see on television, just fluorescent lights, a weary judge with reading glasses perched too low on his nose, and a courtroom that faintly smelled of dust and disinfectant. But in that small county courthouse, seated behind a scarred wooden table next to Elaine Turner and a state-appointed counsel, I felt something monumental unfolding. For the first time in a year, the HOA was finally the one answering questions, not asking them. They hadn't brought Brad. Of course they hadn't. He'd lawyered up weeks before and was conveniently out of state visiting family. In his place sat two board members, Margie Fisher and Alan Pike, stiff in their chairs, looking as though they would rather be anywhere else. The state's case was clear and damning. Elaine presented the documented violations: installation of unpermitted drainage infrastructure, absence of engineering certifications, failure to file required environmental impact assessments, and breach of the HOA's own governing covenants. Each infraction was substantiated by photographs, measurements, emails, and contractor invoices subpoenaed from Outsource Environmental Solutions. That last item proved to be the decisive blow. The invoice from Outsource detailed the project in plain English. Install 6-inch steel outflow pipe at South Shore per HOA President Whitmore's instruction. Target volume release 15,000 gallons. Small lake. No permit required per client's direction. The judge raised an eyebrow. Did the board ever consult a licensed environmental engineer? He inquired. Alan looked at Margie. Margie swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, she replied softly. Did you notify homeowners of your intent to modify the lake's water retention? No. Did you vote on it during an open meeting? No. Were you aware the pipe would reduce the lake volume by over 4 feet in 3 weeks? A pause. No. Elaine didn't need to gloat. The evidence spoke for itself. Then it was my turn. The state attorney nodded, and I stood. I took the oath, sat at the witness table, and recounted my story, not with emotion, but with precision. I described the morning scout growled at the shoreline. I guided the court through my data collection, my warnings, my photographs. I presented the strategy for retaliation, the penalties, the spurious infractions, the public humiliation. I articulated that my sole motivation was safeguarding the pristine condition of our shared environment, a condition that should never have been compromised. The judge listened, occasionally nodding and jotting down notes. Near the conclusion, he inquired, Mr. Hargrove, what compelled you to undertake such an extensive effort? I met his gaze. It was because their actions were depleting more than just water. They were eroding trust, community spirit, and that sense of tranquil contentment one experiences when their home feels attuned to their presence. That body of water nurtured our children, offered solace in our sorrows, and united us. Yet, they treated it as a mere inconvenience, a reservoir to be managed with calculations on a ledger. A palpable quiet descended upon the courtroom. Someone had to take a stand. He gave a single decisive nod. That was sufficient. The judge recessed for 30 minutes before returning with his verdict. It was delivered with expediency. I ruled that the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association is in contravention of state environmental mandates, county licensing ordinances, and its own governing charter. Consequently, they are hereby directed to 1. Immediately halt all existing and future modifications to the lake. 2. remit a civil penalty of $85,000 to the state's environmental fund. 3. Provide recompense to the Oak Hollow community through a state-monitored lake restoration initiative to be completed within a span of 12 months. 4. Conduct a new election for the entire board of directors within 45 days. Failure to adhere to these directives will result in further legal proceedings. I offered no outward display of triumph. No triumphant gesture escaped me. I simply inhaled deeply, a long, steadying breath. As I rose, Elaine placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did well," she affirmed. Outside the courthouse, a contingent of reporters awaited, their cameras flashing, their questions shouted. I paid them no mind. My presence wasn't for the sake of publicity, but Dana's was evident. She stood just beyond the walkway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, handing me one, "when I first moved here, I genuinely believed this place was idyllic." Then the HOA emerged. I began to question my own sanity, wondering if the lake was genuinely deteriorating on its own. But you remained resolute. "I faltered many times," I admitted, offering a faint smile. "But you persevered." She looked directly into my eyes. "That's more than most could manage." That weekend the signs began to disappear, the bright orange notices of violation, the pronouncements of HOA meetings, the leaflets promoting the optimization of the lakeside environment. In their stead, a new announcement appeared at the community center, a notice for a special election announcing vacant board positions. Residents perused it as if it were the first genuine dawn after a prolonged tempest. I did not seek a position. It was no longer necessary. However, I did participate in the subsequent neighborhood assembly, a potluck held near the walking path. One individual contributed smoked brisket, another offered melodic tunes on a guitar, and someone, whose identity I never ascertained, distributed small lapel pins crafted in the likeness of lake reeds, bearing the inscription, "I believed in the water." I affixed mine to my shirt, chuckled, and observed the sun casting its warm glow across the diminished expanse of the lake. Its full recovery had not yet been achieved, but it was at least liberated. And now the truth was not merely acknowledged, it was irrevocably documented in judicial records, journalistic accounts, and the narratives that neighbors would exchange over garden fences for years to come. The morning following the court's decision, a subtle transformation occurred in Oak Hollow, extending beyond policy to the very spirit of the community. It was not an overt change, devoid of fanfare or grand pronouncements, but its presence was palpable. The pervasive tension that had ensnared our neighborhood like an insidious, creeping vine began to recede. In its wake, something gentler started to blossom: trust. The initial indication I observed was an email dispatched by the interim HOA secretary, an individual I barely recognized prior to the hearings. It read, "Dear residents, we are initiating a comprehensive review of all prior HOA actions, citations, and penalties issued within the last 2 years. If you believe you were unjustly cited or fined, please contact our transitional committee via email. Our aim is to rectify any past wrongs." That term, rectify? I must have read it no fewer than 3 times. I forwarded the email to Jorge, the gentleman whose vehicle had been impounded. His response consisted of 3 thumbs-up emojis and a message stating he had already submitted the invoice. "Thanks again, man," his reply concluded. Subsequently, apologies began to surface. Not in a unified surge, nor through ostentatious displays, but discreetly exchanged across driveways and mailboxes during casual strolls or while walking dogs. Mrs. DeMarco beckoned me over one morning as I was tending to my hedges. "I was afraid," she confessed. "That's why I never spoke up. I feared they would target me too, or worse." I offered a reassuring nod. "You were not alone," she confided. "They attempted to cite me for having a trellis that was excessively ornate. Can you believe that?" I managed a smile. "That sounds entirely plausible." She paused, then, without prior indication, reached out and embraced me. A brief clasp, a glimmer of moisture in the corner of her eye. "We have our neighborhood back," she stated. The news spread with remarkable celerity. The HOA's $85,000 civil penalty was allocated equally between the state and a community fund designated for ecological restoration. This effectively transformed the lake from a mere HOA liability into a zone designated for state-supervised ecological recovery. The Department of Environmental Protection published a detailed timeline for the restoration efforts online. Month 1, 2, removal of unauthorized piping and contaminated soil. Months 3 through 6, regrading of the shoreline and the planting of indigenous flora. Months 7 through 12, reintroduction of aquatic life and the installation of monitoring sensors. They even established an online portal for volunteer sign-ups. Donna registered, as did the Crawfords, the Tanakas, and over 30 additional families within the initial week. And then a truly beautiful development occurred. Children started returning to the water's edge, not for swimming just yet, as the algae still required time to dissipate, but out of sheer curiosity. They accompanied their parents, probing the mud with sticks, counting tiny tadpoles in the shallow pools. One group even created vibrant chalk murals along the perimeter of the walking path. Depictions of fish, frogs, birds, and cheerful suns adorned the pavement. One child had meticulously inscribed in block letters, "Please don't hurt the lake again." I captured a photograph of it, had it framed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I slept soundly until my phone rang one morning. It was a young woman named Alyssa, an attorney affiliated with the alt-statewide HOA Oversight Initiative. "It appears our case has generated significant interest beyond our county," she explained. "We've received dozens of complaints filed since your hearing." She continued, "Your testimony was instrumental in initiating a legal review of HOA enforcement abuses across numerous districts." "I'm glad it was helpful," I responded cautiously. "There's discussion about introducing legislation in the upcoming legislative session to curtail HOA authority over shared natural resources. They are proposing to call it the Oak Hollow Provision." I sat down slowly. "Wait, that's a genuine possibility?" "It's gaining momentum," she confirmed. "Your case demonstrated the consequences of unchecked power and a lack of accountability." A smile, one I couldn't suppress, began to spread across my face. Later that week, another surprise awaited me. A young man appeared at my doorstep, tall and appearing somewhat apprehensive, clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Hargrove," he began, "my name is Elijah. I'm a candidate for the newly formed HOA board. A group of us are working to implement reforms in how the HOA operates, advocating for increased transparency, open meetings, and genuine community engagement. Dana mentioned you might be willing to lend your support." I studied him, barely out of his formative years perhaps, yet his gaze was steady. I gestured towards the lake. "Walk with me." We ambled along the familiar path, still bearing the marks of past turmoil, still in the process of mending. I recounted the essence of our struggle, what had been perilously close to being lost, and what still demanded vigilant protection. By the time we circled back to the road, I declared, "You have my vote, but more significantly, you have my assistance." A broad smile illuminated his face. "That means more than you can possibly imagine." Justice does not always manifest in the confines of a courtroom. Occasionally, it arrives in gentle currents, in the mending of a single dock plank, the dismissal of a solitary citation, or the simple chalk drawing of a child beside the water, and its influence rippled outward, not merely through Oak Hollow, but across county lines, within online HOA forums, and into the hands of individuals who had previously felt utterly disempowered. Because when one person takes a stand, not fueled by animosity, but by an unwavering commitment to truth, others are reminded of their own capacity to rise. That weekend, we held a ceremony to bless the lake. It was not a formal affair, lacking any ordained clergy, but rather a gathering of neighbors, each bringing flowers, biodegradable candles, and cherished memories. We lined the southern bank, the very section that had been so brutally scarred by that ill-fated pipe, and gently released the candles to drift across the modest body of water that had by then partially returned. And for the first time in a year, I perceived not shadows, but an undeniable luminescence. It did not return instantaneously. The lake healed much like aging bone, with slow, creaking groans and an unpredictable rhythm. For weeks the water's surface remained largely undisturbed. Then, following a substantial rainfall in May, the water level swelled just enough to lap against the base of the dock once more. It wasn't precisely as it had been, but it was close enough that Scout tentatively dipped his paws in without hesitation and then looked back at me as if to say, "See? I told you it wasn't gone." By the height of summer, the wildflowers had reappeared. Goldenrod, black-eyed Susans, purple loosestrife, the very same varieties my wife used to delight in identifying from the porch, naming them as if they were dear friends. The frogs, too, made their triumphant return, their chorus filling the twilight hours with their resonant croaking. Dragonflies darted and danced across the water's surface. I observed minnows, once more, albeit only a few, yet their presence was a significant affirmation. Each subtle ripple felt like a promise fulfilled. The restoration teams labored diligently, but with a profound sense of respect. They eschewed brute force, opting instead for an artistic sculpting of the environment. They meticulously rebuilt the bank using indigenous stones, strategically placed choir logs to prevent future erosion, and extended an invitation to the community to join them in planting marsh grasses along the water's edge. I arrived with my shovel and a folding chair. We worked side by side with children, retirees, and young couples who had recently relocated to the area. Some brought provisions for lunch. One young boy sported a t-shirt emblazoned with the words "Team Lake" in vibrant crayon lettering. When he offered me a juice box, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. I had spent months entrenched in a combative posture, immersed in documents, hearings, citations, and testimonies. Now I had to relearn the art of stillness, to draw breath without anticipating the next onslaught. It was not an effortless transition. Trauma does not simply strike and depart, it leaves an enduring imprint, particularly when its source is the very place one calls home. Yet healing had also commenced, not solely for the lake, but for myself as well. I painstakingly reconstructed the cedar bench, the original one that had been subjected to vandalism. This time, I meticulously carved a quote into the backrest. Something simple, yet profound. A reflection of words my wife had spoken after her final bout of chemotherapy as we sat upon that very spot years ago. We protect what we love, or we lose it. My neighbors took notice. One by one they began to visit, to sit beside me. Their intentions were not to revisit past grievances, but simply to exist in the present moment, in a state of tranquility, in quiet witness. Donna was a frequent visitor. She brought Scout small treats, and myself steaming cups of coffee. On some mornings, not a single word was exchanged. We simply watched the wind create fleeting patterns on the water's surface and listened to the gentle hum of life returning. In September, the lake reached 90% of its original volume. The relevant department issued a comprehensive report detailing substantial ecological recovery. However, I found the empirical data unnecessary. I had the symphony of birdsong. I had the sunlight shimmering across the placid water. I had the distant sounds of laughter drifting from across the trail. One evening, during a neighborhood gathering, a motion was unanimously passed to rename the dock Harrow's Landing. I attempted to demur, genuinely, but they would not be dissuaded. "You saved it," Dana declared, clinking her glass against mine. "Now, let it bear your name." I was uncertain how to embrace such an honor, but I knew with absolute certainty how to sit in quiet contemplation and profound gratitude. A few months later, a new sign was erected at the entrance to the lake trail. It read, "Oak Hollow, Nature Commons, Protected Watershed, Community Stewardship Zone." Beneath this inscription, a roster of names of volunteer stewards was displayed. Mine was among them. So too were Dana's, the Crawfords, the Tanakas, Jorge's, and even young Elijah's, who had gone on to secure the presidency of the HOA with an overwhelming majority, championing a campaign centered on transparency and environmental reverence. Curiously, he never once mentioned me in his addresses. It was unnecessary. The lake itself had spoken with sufficient volume, and its voice continued to resonate. On the anniversary of the court's ruling, we organized a remembrance walk. It was not a protest, nor a rally, but simply a leisurely stroll. A slow, gentle procession of families, individuals, elders leaning on canes, and children trailing fishing poles. Scout trotted ahead, visibly aged now, his muzzle graying, but carrying himself with pride, his tail held high as if he understood. We concluded our walk at the dock. Candles were lit. A violin began to play. I was invited to offer some remarks. I kept my words concise. "This lake," I began, "has taught me patience. It has shown me how to contend without harboring animosity, how to stand firm without raising my voice, and how to believe that truth holds inherent value even when it presents challenges." I surveyed the tranquil water. Thank you all for listening and for fighting alongside me. Later that evening, back at my residence, I discovered an envelope tucked into my mailbox. It bore no return address. Inside was a photograph, an aerial view of the lake, now full once more, encircled by a vibrant tapestry of color and life. On the reverse side, a handwritten message simply stated, "You turned the tide. Forever grateful." No signature accompanied the note. I placed it beside the framed chalk drawing from that insightful child. "Please don't hurt the lake again." Side by side, these two artifacts conveyed everything that needed to be expressed. I returned to the bench that evening. The fading light cast a soft, golden, and forgiving glow. Scout rested his chin upon my boot. The lake was alive, and I too was beginning to truly live again.